Sanitary conditions were the worst, and the voyage from Africa to America usually took a month or two, and the slaves who had insufficient food died on board. As the journey could take up to 6 months, the surviving blacks had to go through unending suffering. It was possible to relieve themselves at some points on the ship. However, since they were all bound with chains, even that was not easy, and they had many cases of no choice but to lay down and relieve themselves. Because of this dire situation, epidemic occurred frequently, and the slaves were forced to continue sailing, lying in sweat, feces, and vomit. When they reached America, 1 in 6 people had died and their bodies had been dumped into the sea. It was like hell floating on the sea. At the height of the slave trade in the 18th century, Britain began to monopolize the slave trade by taking it from Spain. This was because, if done well, they could sell slaves and earn up to 5 times as much. They did a triangular trade. In Europe, wine and woolen textiles were loaded onto ships and then exported to Africa to exchange for black slaves. Then, carrying black people on the ship, they went on a voyage of death for about a month to the Americas. Upon arrival, the slaves were sold and forced to work for their masters until the day they died. Finally, the British merchants returned to Europe with the sugar, coffee, and tobacco produced by the slaves transported on their ships. As the slave trade grew into an international business, Britain benefited most. Later, the money obtained from this triangular trade played a major role in the Industrial Revolution in England. So, after the 18th century, England became the protagonist of the Atlantic Ocean. In other words, the blood and tears of black Africans made them rich. Meanwhile, on the mainland of Africa, people were struggling not to be dragged away by Europeans. In order to survive, they frequently caught and sold other tribes' people in the surrounding area. Therefore, even within Africa, in order to expand the territory and capture prisoners of war, people had to constantly war with neighboring tribes and countries in order not to die at the hands of Europeans. Among them, the Kingdom of Dahomey, led by King Agaja, conquered the cities of the Atlantic coast and emerged as a regional power. As the King Dahomey gained regional hegemony, it became a major supplier of the Atlantic slave trade. So later, it became known as a center where 20% of the kidnapped slaves were traded here. Traces of these European atrocities still remain in Africa. The island of Gore, located in Senegal, was once the largest slave trade center on the African coast. Even now, even if you go there, the houses and exhibits of slaves where they were imprisoned are still preserved. This is a 2-story building where the first floor was where the slaves were kept, and the second floor was where the people who controlled them lived. About 40 slaves were locked up on the first floor. They were held in chains until they were sold to Europeans, and all slaves had to be imprisoned all the times except for once a day to go to the bathroom. In addition, it is said that people who weighed less than 60 kilograms were judged to be less valuable as slaves. So they were made to gain weight until they reached 60 kilograms and then sold. Those who passed the standard were brought for auction in the front yard, and those who were weak or ill were thrown into the sea. Unfortunately, there were many sharks in this sea. Even in this situation, there were heroes in America who risked their lives to free black slaves. One hero was Harriet Tubman. Born around 1820, she was also forced to be a slave from her birth. as her parents were slaves brought to America from Africa. From a young age, she was beaten by numerous owners and once hit in the head with a heavy iron and suffered severe injuries for the rest of her life. Through her suffering as her parents were slaves brought to America from Africa, she began to cherish her longing for freedom. Her health deteriorated and the owner wanted to sell her to someone else. But she thought she would not see her family once she was sold, so she risked her life to escape. Slaves at that time were almost illiterate, so it was not easy to escape.